The training hall was a thunderous hive of energy boots, striking the floor in perfect rhythm. Instructors barking orders sharp enough to slice through the chatter, and recruits grunting through push-ups, sit-ups, and drills. The air smelled of sweat, rubber mats, and anticipation. It was just another grueling day of basic training. Among the rows of fresh recruits stood a woman who barely seemed to belong there. She was smaller than the others, her frame lean rather than bulky, her demeanor quiet and reserved. Unlike her peers who puffed out their chests, cracked jokes, and showed off their strength, she kept her eyes down, conserving her energy. Never rising to provocation, to the recruits around her, she was an easy target. Some whispered she must have slipped into the program by mistake. Others joked about how long she'd last before breaking, but if their words reached her, she gave no sign. The moment came when the drill sergeant decided the recruits needed a lesson in humility. Towering, broad-shouldered, and notorious for his no-nonsense brutality, he called for a sparring demonstration in the center of the hall. "Combat is where weakness gets exposed," he barked, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Today we find out who's got fight tanned, who doesn't." Murmurs ran through the ranks as he pointed not at one of the strapping men in the front row, but at her. The recruits erupted with laughter. One snickered. "She'll be flat on the mat before she even touches him." Another muttered, "She'll be fun." She didn't flinch. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, tightening the strap of her gloves as if she had expected this moment all along. The sergeant smirked, towering over her as they squared off. "Don't take this personal," he sneered, loud enough for the recruits to hear. "But you're about to show everyone why dead weight doesn't belong here?" A ripple of chuckles echoed through the room. The whistle blew. The sergeant lunged fast, closing the gap with the speed of a predator. In one brutal motion, he hooked her arm, swept her leg, and slammed her to the mat with a crash that reverberated through the hall. The recruits erupted in laughter, stomping and hollering. Convinced it was over in seconds, the sergeant stood above her, arms crossed, a smug grin stretched across his face. "Quick enough," he barked. For a heartbeat, the hall buzzed with mockery. But then something shifted. She wasn't lying still. Slowly, calmly, she rose to her feet. Her expression was unreadable, not humiliated, not angry, just focused. Her movements weren't clumsy or uncertain. They were measured, precise, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The laughter faltered. The recruits quieted, sensing something different in her presence now. The sergeant's smirk flickered just slightly, as if some instinct whispered that he had underestimated her. Seconds later, the energy in the hall would change entirely. Before that day in the training hall, her reputation had already been decided for her. From the very first week of boot camp, she stood out not for brilliance, not for arrogance, but for being different. She wasn't the loudest in the room. She wasn't the one doing extra push-ups just to show off. She didn't boast about her high school wrestling titles or her football trophies like some of the men did. Instead, she blended into the background, quiet and steady, moving through the days with the kind of patience that drew little attention, and in an environment where ego was currency, that patience was mistaken for weakness. During morning runs, she always finished somewhere in the middle, not lagging behind, but not sprinting to the front either. "She's just pacing herself," one recruit muttered. Another scoffed, "Nah, she doesn't have the lungs for this." In the mess hall, she sat alone more often than not, chewing her food in silence, while clusters of recruits swapped war stories or bragged about the lives they left behind. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to prove herself, didn't jump into their contests of bravado. To them, her silence was evidence. She didn't belong. The whispers started small. "She won't make it through the month. She looks like she belongs in an office, not a battlefield. Bet the instructors are just keeping her around for quotas." Even the instructors weren't immune. Though they never said it outright, their eyes lingered on her during drills, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for the moment they could point and say, "See? She's not cut out for this." But she didn't stumble. She didn't shine either, not in a way that demanded attention. She completed every obstacle, carried her packs without complaint, and hit her marks with quiet consistency. It Was this consistency that unnerved the few who paid close attention? Because while the others burned themselves out trying to prove their toughness in front of their peers, she seemed to conserve her energy, saving it for something more important. Like a chess player holding back the winning move. She never revealed the full extent of what she could do. Still, perception is powerful, and perception painted her as fragile, unfit, someone who would wash out before the real tests began. The breaking point came one evening during hand-to-hand drills. The recruits had spent the entire day grinding through physical training, and exhaustion hung over the hall like a heavy fog. Instructors prowled the mats, barking orders, pushing them to the edge of collapse. That's when the drill sergeant decided to teach a lesson. "Pick a partner," he growled. The recruits paired off, some grinning with excitement, others groaning with fatigue. Then, after a pause, he scanned the group and pointed straight at her. "You, step forward." The room went still for half a second before the snickers began. One of the recruits leaned toward his buddy and whispered, "Dead woman walking." Another shook his head. "She's about to get wrecked." The sergeant motioned toward himself. "You're with me." It was unthinkable. Sparring a fellow recruit was one thing, but going up against him? A man built like a bulldozer, a veteran of multiple deployments, infamous for throwing grown men across the mat like rag dolls. The recruits leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle. They weren't interested in technique or discipline. They wanted blood, or at least humiliation. And to them, humiliation was certain. She walked forward anyway. No hesitation, no stutter in her step. Her face remained calm, unreadable, though her hands curled into fists at her sides, not in fear. "But in readiness, sir," she said, giving the smallest respectful nod. The sergeant sneered. "Don't bother being polite. This isn't tea time." The recruits laughed again, louder this time, feeding on his mockery. They circled. The sergeant cracked his knuckles, rolling his shoulders like a predator, preparing to pounce. He towered over her, his shadow stretching across her smaller frame. To the crowd, it was a picture of inevitability, power versus fragility, brute force versus someone who barely belonged. "Remember, recruits," the sergeant barked, eyes still locked on her. "This is what happens when you step into an arena you don't belong." "Ah!" The whistle shrieked, and the lesson began. The whistle cut through the air like a blade, sharp and merciless. The sergeant moved first. He didn't creep forward cautiously or test her defenses like an equal opponent. No, he lunged, fast and brutal, as though swatting a fly. His thick arms swung in, hooking toward her collar, aiming to lift and throw her to the mat before the match even had a chance to begin. For a second, it looked like he'd succeeded. The crowd of recruits gasped as his hand clamped her shoulder and yanked her forward. Her body tilted off balance, her boots leaving the ground. A flicker of triumph crossed the sergeant's face as he barked, "Too easy." But then something changed. Before she hit the mat, she twisted, her body rotating with the momentum he'd given her. Instead of slamming down helplessly, she rolled out of his grip, landing on one knee, spring-loaded like a coiled spring. It was so fast, so precise, that for a moment no one understood what had happened. The recruits blinked. The sergeant frowned. She rose, eyes steady, posture calm, as though she hadn't just escaped the grip of a man who could crush her like a rag doll. "Lucky break," he growled. But luck had nothing to do with it. The second clash came harder. He came at her with raw strength, arms wide, trying to engulf her in a bear hug that would squeeze the breath out of her lungs. This time, she didn't retreat. She stepped into his charge. The crowd shouted in disbelief. Was she insane? Her small frame vanished beneath his massive arms then. Suddenly she shifted. With a twist of her hips and a precise drop of her center of gravity, she redirected his force. Instead of locking her into a hold, his own momentum sent him stumbling forward, arms clutching at empty air. The recruit's laughter died down, replaced by stunned silence. The sergeant wheeled around, his face flushed with irritation. This wasn't how the lesson was supposed to go. He was supposed to dominate, to humiliate, to reinforce the pecking order. Instead, this quiet woman was turning the rules upside down. Again, he barked, charging with renewed fury. This time he slammed into her hard, tackling with the full weight of his body. She absorbed the impact, sliding back across the mat, but she didn't crumble. Instead, her hands moved like lightning, locking onto his wrist, twisting at just the right angle. His grunt of pain cut through the room. The crowd erupted. "Holy, did you see that?" She reversed him. "No way. That's advanced grappling." The sergeant tried to shake her off, but she tightened her hold, her knuckles white with controlled pressure. She wasn't just surviving, she was controlling him for the first time. His confidence wavered. Her face remained calm, almost expressionless. But her scars, those faint ridges of old battles that stretched across her hands and forearms, spoke louder than words. She'd been here before. Maybe not in this exact room, not against this exact man, but in places darker, harsher, where a mistake meant death. It's not just embarrassment. He ripped free with sheer force, panting slightly now. Around them, the recruits shifted, murmurs spreading like wildfire. The energy in the room had changed. They weren't laughing anymore, they were watching, captivated. Realizing something none of them had expected, she wasn't weak. She wasn't slow. She wasn't fragile. She was dangerous. The sergeant roared, rushing again, this time with less technique and more raw aggression. But raw aggression has one flaw: it leaves openings. And she saw them all. He swung. She ducked. He lunged. She pivoted. He tried to trap her. She slipped free like water. Every move he made, she turned against him, using his strength as a weapon against him. And then it happened, the moment that silenced the hall completely. He grabbed for her collar again, yanking her forward with the same move he'd started with, determined to finish it this time. But instead of resisting, she flowed with it, spinning into his chest. In one seamless motion, she locked her leg around his, twisted her body, and leveraged his own momentum against him. The massive sergeant hit the mat with a thunderous crash that shook the floor. Gasps filled the room. Recruits jumped to their feet, unable to believe what they'd just seen. Their unshakable, unbreakable drill sergeant, the man who terrified them daily, who seemed untouchable, was flat on his back, pinned beneath the weight of the one person they'd all dismissed as weak, her knee pressed into his chest. Her grip locked his arm in a hold that no amount of strength could break. The whistle blew. Shrill and final, the match was over. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was heavy, filled with disbelief. Then, slowly, she released him, rising to her feet. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't even look at the stunned faces surrounding her. She simply adjusted her sleeve, the scars catching the light again, and gave a small nod of respect. The sergeant stayed on the mat, his pride more battered than his body. He sat up, glaring, but there was something new in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Not mockery, not dismissal, but respect, grudging and reluctant, yet undeniable. The recruits? Their world had shifted. The hierarchy they thought was unshakable had just been rewritten, and the woman they had laughed at minutes ago was now the one they couldn't stop staring at. The room didn't sound like a training hall anymore. The echoes of stomping boots, jeering laughter, and sharp commands had been replaced by a silence so heavy it was almost tangible. It was the silence of shock, of disbelief, of grudging awe. The recruits stood frozen in place, eyes darting between the sergeant still kneeling on the mat, breath ragged, and the woman who had just toppled him. She stood tall, not triumphant, not smug, but calm, her expression unreadable. It was that quiet confidence, more than the takedown itself, that unsettled them. One recruit muttered, barely above a whisper, "Oh, way, she just did that." Another responded, "We all saw it. He's on the ground." She put him there. Their whispers spread like wildfire through the ranks. Minutes ago, they'd mocked her, dismissed her as nothing but a mistake in the system, a recruit too small, too fragile, too out of place. Now none of them dared to laugh. The sergeant pushed himself up slowly, brushing the dust from his uniform. His face was red, not just from exertion, but from the humiliation of being bested in front of the very recruits he commanded. For a long moment, he stared at her. His pride screamed at him to reassert his authority, to snarl, to bark, to remind them all who was in charge. But deep down, he knew what had just happened wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. He had thrown everything at her brute, strength, speed, aggression, and she had dismantled it piece by piece with precision, patience, and skill that went beyond anything he had expected. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was gruff, but lower than usual. "On your feet, recruits." The others snapped to attention instantly, but their eyes never left the woman. The sergeant paced slowly across the mat, his boots thudding with each deliberate step. Then he stopped, turning back toward them. His words carried weight, echoing off the walls. "You think strength is in size? You think it's in who can yell the loudest, hit the hardest, or throw the biggest punch? That's what most of you believe, and you're wrong." His gaze shifted to her. She didn't flinch. "Strength," he continued, "is in control, discipline, skill, using your head when everyone else loses theirs. She just gave you a lesson none of you will forget." The recruits shifted uneasily, processing his words. Some looked ashamed for how they had mocked her earlier. Others stared at her with newfound respect, though they weren't ready to admit it out loud. One thing was clear. The hierarchy had changed. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, but his tone carried a grudging acknowledgement. She earned it. It was subtle, but those 3 words carried more weight than any lecture. In the military, respect wasn't handed out lightly, was earned, sometimes painfully, often brutally. And in a single sparring match, she had earned it. The recruits glanced at her again, this time differently. They no longer saw the weak woman they'd laughed at. They saw someone who had scars etched not just into her skin, but into her experience. Someone who knew more about real combat than any of them could imagine. The scars on her hands, once the subject of whispers, now looked like proof that she had fought, survived, and carried battles no one else in that room could comprehend. As the sergeant dismissed the session, the recruits filed out quietly. Normally, chatter would erupt the moment drills ended. Complaints about push-ups, jokes about mistakes, banter about who had done better. Not this time. Not today. Today, silence followed them out. Only when they reached the barracks did the whispers begin again. "Did you see how fast she moved?" one asked, still wide-eyed. Another muttered, "He's never been thrown like that before. Never." There was no denying it anymore. Whatever doubts they had about her being in the program had been crushed in that training hall. Back on the mat, the sergeant lingered. He stood beside her as the room emptied, his jaw tight. She expected another challenge, perhaps another attempt to reassert dominance. Instead, he surprised her. "You've done this before," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Her gaze met his. For a moment, she considered answering, but instead, she gave a small nod and adjusted her sleeve to hide her scars again. That was enough. The sergeant exhaled, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well, you'll keep them guessing." "That's good. That's how leaders are made." For the first time, his words carried not mockery, but something that resembled mentorship, and that was the true victory. That night, the barracks were alive with whispers. The recruits lay in their bunks, but no one slept. The sparring match replayed in their minds over and over again. She dropped him like it was nothing. Did you see her hands? Those scars? They weren't training scars. She's hiding something. The murmurs grew until one of the recruits finally voiced what they were all thinking. Who is she really? The next morning, the drill sergeant stood at his desk, staring at a folder he'd been trying not to open for days. It was her file, classified in parts, redacted heavily in others. Most recruits had pages of basic background, education, physical scores, family history. Hers was different. Thick black lines blotted out entire sections, leaving only fragments. A deployment here, a commendation there, and tucked between them, words that made even him pause. Joint Special Operations Command, Active duty assignment. Clearance level. Restricted. His jaw tightened. She wasn't supposed to be here, at least not in the ordinary sense. When the commanding officer walked in, the sergeant snapped to attention. The officer gave a knowing look at the file. "They told you not to dig, didn't they?" The sergeant hesitated. "Yes, sir. But the recruits are already talking. They want to know who she is." The officer leaned closer. "Let them talk. She's not here to blend in. She's here to test them, to show them what's possible. And if they're smart, they'll learn from her." By midday, the tension boiled over. During a break in drills, a group of recruits cornered her near the equipment racks. One of the louder ones crossed his arms, his tone sharp. "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" "No way, that's standard training," another chimed in. "You've seen real combat, haven't you?" "Those scars tell us they're from the field." She looked at them, calm but unreadable. For a moment, she considered brushing it off. But then her eyes softened just slightly. "You think you're ready for war because you can run 5 miles and throw a punch?" she said quietly. War isn't drills. It isn't mats. It's the silence before an ambush. The weight of someone else's life depending on you. It's losing people and still having to move forward. The recruits froze, stunned by the gravity in her voice. She hadn't answered directly, but she didn't have to. They could hear the experience laced in every word. Later that evening, one of the younger recruits caught her alone, sitting on the steps outside the mess hall. He spoke cautiously, almost respectfully. "Those scars on your hands. They're from combat, aren't they?" She studied him for a long moment. Finally, she pulled back her sleeve, letting the pale moonlight trace over the jagged lines across her skin. "They're from holding onto weapons too long. From breaking down doors. From fights where hesitation meant death. They're from survival." The recruit swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance gone. "Why are you here then? If you've already been through all that." Her eyes drifted toward the parade ground, where rows of recruits had stumbled and sweated earlier that day. "Because one day you'll be out there, and you'll think it's all about being the toughest, the loudest, the strongest. But it's not. It's about discipline, patience, and knowing when to strike. If you don't learn that now, you won't survive later." By the next morning, the whispers had turned into something different. No longer mockery, no longer doubt. Now it was respect, awe, even fear. "She's special forces. She's seen things none of us could handle. She's not like Ushi's above." The sergeant noticed the shift. For the first time, recruits who had laughed at her now stood straighter when she passed. They listened more carefully when she spoke, even without a title, without rank. She commanded something rarer than authority. She commanded respect. The sergeant's admission during a final drill of the week, the sergeant addressed the squad. His voice carried differently, now firmer, but also less condescending. "You all think you know what makes a soldier, but this week, you've seen the truth. Real strength isn't about ego. It's about skill honed through experience. Discipline when the world is chaos. Resolve when others break." He paused, his gaze locking on her. "She's lived that truth. And if you're wise, you'll learn from her before you ever see a battlefield." For the first time, the recruits applauded, not mockingly, not sarcastically, but with genuine respect. And she didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply stood quietly, letting the moment pass. Because for her, it was never about recognition. It was about passing the torch, ensuring the next generation learned the lessons she had bled for. The recruits thought the week had already been the hardest of their lives. They were wrong. On Saturday morning, the drill sergeant blew his whistle at dawn, his voice cutting through the fog. "Gear up, full combat load. Today you're not recruits. You're a squad under fire." The words sent a ripple of tension through the camp. Everyone knew what it meant, the simulation exercise. It was designed to break them, to expose every weakness, physical, mental, and emotional, as they marched to the training grounds. Whispers trailed behind. Everyone's eyes flicked toward her. If she was really what the rumors said, today would prove it. The mock battlefield stretched across several miles of forest and ruined structures. Hidden speakers played the sounds of distant gunfire, artillery, and helicopters. Smoke grenades curled through the trees, turning the morning air thick and gray. The sergeant briefed them. "You've got one objective. Reach the extraction point before the recruits moved into the forest in staggered formation, the crack of blank rounds snapping through the trees. Instructors hidden in towers played the role of the enemy, launching surprise ambushes, detonating controlled charges, and blaring disorienting sounds. It didn't take long for panic to creep in. One recruit froze after a simulated mortar round boomed nearby. Another sprinted off course, breaking formation. The sergeant, watching from a ridge, shook his head. "They're falling apart already," he muttered. But not her. She crouched low, scanning the tree line, her breathing steady. "Stay down," she hissed to the two nearest recruits, pulling them into cover just before a barrage of paintball rounds tore through the air where they had been.
Ow.
"How did you know?" "Patterns," she said simply. "No one attacks blind. They set traps. Learn to see them." As the squad stumbled deeper into the mock battlefield, chaos escalated. Half the team argued about which direction to take. The rest panicked every time the instructors fired another round. She didn't wait for orders. Moving silently through the brush, she spotted the faint glint of tripwires strung across a narrow path. Without hesitation, she held up her fist, the universal signal to stop. The squad froze, surprised they had obeyed her without question. "Booby trap," she said. "Take the left flank." Slow, controlled, they followed, and for the first time, the recruits moved as a unit instead of a gaggle of terrified individuals. From the ridge, the sergeant's eyes narrowed. He recognized it instantly. She had slipped into the role of squad leader. It's not by authority, but by natural command. Hours passed. The recruits were soaked in sweat, lungs burning, legs heavy with exhaustion. The instructors turned up the pressure, ambushing from above, detonating charges near their path, sending smoke rolling through the woods. When the squad reached a clearing, the loudspeakers boomed. "Casualty simulation. You're under fire." Paintballs shredded the clearing. One recruit went down, tagged with a red mark across his vest. Another dropped to his knees, clutching his helmet in panic. The squad froze again, caught between fear and indecision, but she sprinted forward. Rolling across the ground, she grabbed the injured recruit by his straps and dragged him to cover with a strength that seemed impossible for her size. "Cover me," she barked. Almost without thinking, the others obeyed, laying down suppressive fire with their rifles. In that instant, something clicked inside them. The laughter, the doubt, the arrogance, they were gone. What replaced it was trust. Blind, unshakable trust in her leadership. By the time the squad reached the final sector, they were battered, exhausted, and mud-streaked. But they were no longer the same group of disorganized recruits who had started the exercise. Every movement was coordinated. Every order was sharp, and every eye flicked toward her for direction. The final challenge came in the form of a fortified bunker manned by instructors. To win, they had to breach and secure it under simulated fire. The squad looked at each other nervously. One muttered, "It's impossible." She shook her head. "No, we flank, distract, and move into waves. First wave suppresses, second wave breaches." Her calm certainty cut through their fear like a blade. The plan unfolded flawlessly. Smoke filled the air, suppressive fire echoed through the trees, and the second wave stormed the bunker with precision. When the final buzzer sounded, signaling the mission's end, the recruits collapsed in the dirt. Panting, they had made it. The sergeant strode down from the ridge, his expression unreadable. The recruits stood at attention, waiting for his inevitable critique. Instead, he looked directly at her. "You took command without being told. You saw what others couldn't. You kept this squad alive." His voice hardened, but there was respect in it. "That's leadership. And every one of you," he swept his gaze across the squad. "Better remember who taught you today." The recruits glanced at her, eyes wide, faces stripped of doubt. She had started the week as a target of laughter, dismissed as weak. Now, She was the reason they had survived the hardest test of their training. For the first time, they didn't see her as different. They saw her as a leader. The recruits stood in a ragged line, mud clinging to their boots, sweat streaking their brows. The forest was quiet now. More explosions, no more ambushes, just the heavy silence after chaos. The sergeant paced in front of them, his boots crunching against leaves. His face was hard, unreadable, and more than a few recruits shifted nervously under his gaze. "Pathetic!" he barked suddenly, his voice cracking through the air. "Half of you nearly fell apart the moment things got rough. You ran when you should have fought. Froze when you should have moved. But—" he stopped mid-stride, eyes narrowing. "One of you didn't." His gaze locked on her. The recruits straightened, every eye turning toward the woman they had mocked just days before. She stood still, chin raised, her uniform soaked and torn, but her posture unshaken. The sergeant folded his arms. This one didn't wait for orders, didn't whine, didn't freeze. She took control when the rest of you fell apart. Without her, you'd still be lying out there in the mud wondering which way was up. A ripple of whispers passed through the recruits, but the sergeant silenced them with a glare. "Do you know why she's here?" he asked, his tone sharp. No one answered. The sergeant's lips curled into a tight smile, not of amusement, but of revelation. "You think she's here as one of you? A recruit?" "Wrong." The recruits blinked, stunned. "She's not here to learn from you," the sergeant continued. "She's here because she's already done what none of you have. Combat. Real war. She's been shot at, dragged men twice her size out of burning vehicles, and stood toe-to-toe with enemies who didn't give her the courtesy of training rounds." The air grew heavier. He jabbed a finger toward the scars on her hands, faintly visible where her sleeves had slid back. "You laughed at those scars, didn't you? Called her weak? Those scars aren't accidents. They're survival. Every line carved into her skin is a reminder that she's still standing when others didn't make it home." The recruits were silent now, their smirks and arrogance evaporating into shame. The sergeant's voice lowered, but it carried even more weight. "You saw a woman in uniform and thought you had her figured out. Thought she didn't belong here. But here's the truth. She's the reason we brought you through this exercise. She was the test." Confusion flickered across their faces. You weren't being evaluated on who could shoot the straightest or shout the loudest. You were being tested on whether you could follow the right leader when it mattered. And every single one of you proved something today. You trusted her when it counted. That's why you're still standing. The recruits glanced at each other, the realization dawning slowly. They hadn't just been competing against exhaustion or fear, they had been measured against their own bias. The sergeant turned back to her, his expression softening by the smallest fraction. "You didn't just pass today. You reminded them what leadership looks like. You reminded me." For the first time since training began, she allowed herself a small smile, not of victory, but of relief. One of the recruits, still catching his breath, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, who is she really?" The sergeant's eyes gleamed. "Ask her." The recruits looked at her, waiting. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she slowly pushed up her sleeve, revealing the ink etched into her forearm, the insignia of her unit marked with a campaign ribbon. Below it, a small Navy cross tattoo, a silent badge of honor few ever earned. Gasps echoed through the squad. They knew what it meant. "I don't need to tell you my story," she said quietly, her voice steady. "All you need to know is this. I've been where you're trying to go. And the only reason I'm still here is because I learned the lesson you learned. Today's strength isn't in size, or rank, or how loud you shout. It's in whether people can count on you when it matters." Silence hung in the air. Then, one by one, the recruits straightened their posture. Not out of fear of the sergeant, but out of respect for her. The sergeant nodded once, satisfied. Dismissed. As the recruits filed out of the clearing, the whispers were different now. No mockery. No laughter. Just reverence. She remained behind for a moment, staring out at the trees, the scars on her hands, catching the last glint of sunlight. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. The respect she had earned today was enough. The sergeant stepped beside her, lowering his voice. "You did well. Better than I expected." She smirked faintly. "Funny you said the same thing the first time we met." His brows rose. "And I meant it then, too." For a brief moment, they shared an understanding only those forged in fire could. Then, without another word, she walked away, her step steady, her presence unshakable. And though the recruits would go on to face countless trials ahead, none of them would forget the day they laughed at her only to be led by her, humbled by her, and forever changed because of her.